study. So thanks so much for joining us this morning and for your interest in the project over its entire course. Before we get too far into the meeting, I just want to ensure that everyone is aware that the Zoom meeting is being recorded, and it will also be made available on the district's Engage Muskoka website so that folks who couldn't join today still have an opportunity to watch, learn, and provide feedback. If you have any feedback to provide, you are welcome to share that at the end of the forthcoming presentation, or you can email me directly. My email is shared at towards the end of the presentation. So with that, I suppose I should introduce myself. My name is Cassie Ems, and I'm a planner here at the district, and I'm also your point person for causation studies. So I'd just like to kick off this meeting with a quick backgrounder of causation studies, as it's been quite some time since we've all been together. So causation studies are initiated in accordance with the Muskoka Official Plan when a lake experiences one of three water quality indicators, one of which being the occurrence of a blue-green algae bloom. The purpose of causation studies is to identify why the lake experienced a water quality indicator, and in this case, Stewart Lake was chosen for the study based on its history of algae blooms in 2010, 2011, and again in 2020. Stewart Lake was also chosen based on high engagement of the Lake Association because of its high development potential. It's located in 2 different municipalities and is also the location of a municipal source water intake, which supplies drinking water to residents of MacDier. There are 4 other causation studies being done concurrently, and while the results of each study will be uniquely and carefully looked at on a lake-by-lake basis, we also have the opportunity to see if there are any trends or patterns about how water quality is being affected across the watershed. The district, the Stewart Lake Association, and other stakeholders on the line are all key players in this project, and like you all, district staff are looking forward to this presentation to learn about the results and recommendations and how the results can inform our land use or development planning process policies. Ultimately, we want to ensure that the outcomes of the study and other concurrent studies can be successfully implemented at the policy and program level. So now let's just move on to a quick introduction. If we can hit the next slide there, Chris. I'd just like to introduce you to the project team. So on the line today, we have Beverly Saunders and Chris Hadley. Beverly is the planning supervisor at EcoView Consulting Services. She has 12 years of experience in environmental and land use planning, as well as policy analysis and development. This includes 4 years of leading watershed planning efforts driven by stakeholder concerns, which are identified through workshops, public meetings, surveys, and one-on-one consultation. Beverly currently works on both private and municipal land use planning projects, with a focus on leading work which involves stakeholder engagement and environmental impact issues. Beverly has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science and a Master's of Science in Aquatic Resources, with a past research focus on consensus-based watershed planning. Dr. Christopher Hadley joined Hutchinson Environmental Science as an NSERC in Industrial Research and Development Fellow in 2013, with completing a postdoctoral fellowship at the Ontario Ministry of Environment and PhD at Queen's University. Chris has worked on a wide array of projects on lakes in the Muskoka-Haliburton region since 2008. Colleagues of mine here at the district that have been involved in the study and who are on the call today include Christy Doyle, Director of Environmental Watershed Programs, Rebecca Willison, Watershed Planning Technician, and Brittany Manley, a planner here at the district. And lastly, but most importantly, on our project team are stakeholders. We have relied on the participation of stakeholders like you throughout the entirety of this project, and that remains true as we approach the final stages of the project. So thank you all to the stakeholders so far, whether you're a Lake Association member, if you live, work, or play on the lake, you have all provided valuable input to help us gain an understanding of the current and past conditions of Stewart Lake. So again, thank you for helping us gather information on the lake, for your interest in this study, and thank you also in advance for providing your feedback on the forthcoming presentation. So without further ado, Beverly, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, Chris, if you want to go to the next slide. So this is just some quick housekeeping. So for everyone to know, so the chat function is going to be monitored with respect to this presentation. You're welcome to post questions in that chat function. The chats will go directly to co-hosts so that we can pose those throughout the presentation, but ideally we'll be posing questions at the end just so that we can get through everything, make sure you've got everything done. The next will be that all participants are muted, but when question and answers come forward, if you raise your hand or have a question, we'll just unmute you so that you can speak directly, or feel free, if you're not comfortable in that format, to put it in the chat box, and then we will read it out and answer those questions. And that's about it. So go ahead to the next slide, Chris. So today's roadmap. So I'll be presenting just to start, just to give a summary of sort of where we are right now. Then from there, we'll go ahead and hand off to Chris, who's the scientist on the file, who has probably the most background and can provide you details of what the study has entailed. I will briefly go over the consultation component. For a reminder, EcoView Consulting was in charge of the consultation component of this project, but most of that information did go to all of that information went to the scientists, and then that was sort of incorporated into the technical work. And so he will speak to how that information was used as well. And then we'll go through Chris will go through the results of the causation study. And then at the end, we'll sort of go through what the next steps are from here. And as I said, there'll be a question and answer period at the end, and we definitely want to hear your questions or concerns that you have. As was stated, this is a recorded meeting, and we are taking notes to make sure that we can address everything and are representing the types of questions that we were receiving in the final consultation report. I will say that this is an hour-and-a-half meeting, so we're going to try to get through this quickly to give plenty of time for questions at the end. If it happens where we cannot answer your question because we weren't able to get to it, or alternatively that it's something we don't know the answer to right now, then we will definitely write that down and make sure that we're responding to it. So there is in the report going to be questions and comments that we've received on the report, so we can include that and then respond that way, or get your contact information and respond back if you would like to email Cassie, and we can answer those. Next slide, Chris. So progress to date, we did have a startup meeting with the consultants in the district. This is just an overview of what happened in the first. We did describe some of this in the first meeting, but just to give an overview because it has been a little while. That included just going over the plan of the project and the consultation process. There was a receipt of data information from the project team, including past studies, existing data, and then Chris and Hutchinson did a gap analysis as well. We hosted a first stakeholder meeting in April 2021, and that was posted on Engage Muskoka for reference, just in case anyone wants to go back and take a look at it. Next slide, please. Survey launch. Oh, just a clarification. Cassie just wanted to remind me that we have allocated 2 hours to this meeting if needed. So I had originally said an hour and a half, so my apologies. I'll just make that correction. In terms of continued progress, we did a survey launch in April 2021, which the results were also posted on Engage Muskoka in July 2021. And that information was also provided to Hutchinson for their review in their scientific proposal. Data collection happened over the course of 2021 and 2022, including field data, which Chris will speak to. There was some delays in obtaining data that was needed, which we're happy to answer questions on as well. But once we received that, we began compiling it and making sure that we had the causation study results, including all of that information. We have completed a first draft of the causation study, which is informing this presentation. This meeting will inform portions of the report so that it can be posted for public review, which we'll talk about in the next steps section at the end of this presentation. And then today is the second stakeholder meeting to go over the draft results. And then, as I said, have a discussion about them and a compilation of questions and concerns. Next slide. So this is just a project timeline. This is in the first presentation. It did originally have us completing the report last year, but as we said, there was some issues obtaining data, and so the updated timelines are now included here. Today's the public meeting. We'll be posting the draft report in 1 week, which we'll talk about, and then the final report is expected in early January. Next slide, Chris. So just in terms of consultation touch points, so as we said, there was the initial stakeholder meeting and feedback. There was so this was used, we did compile this information. There was comments that provided additional data and asked questions about data, what that could be provided to the scientists to help their research. It helped identify those data sources, and in general was used for the terms of reference for the study. We also had over 50 past and ongoing emails sent to district staff, which were then forwarded on to our team. All these correspondences were reviewed and used or referenced or incorporated into the assessment to support conclusions. There will be I guess a summary of the information that was provided in the report as a part of the consultation report portion, just to give a sense of what we received, make sure that you all know that what you provided us was seen and reviewed, and then just quickly stating how it was used or not and for what reason. And then the last touch point that we've had so far is the public survey, and these were used to corroborate results. And as I said, the results of the public survey were posted on Engage Muskoka as well. Next slide. So with that, I'll hand it over to Chris to go over the results of the causation study, and then we'll touch bases at the end for question and answers. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Beverly.
Thanks, Chris.
So the science side of the causation studies began with the Peninsula Lake pilot program study in 2019. Neil Hutchinson and myself developed a framework that we wanted to follow in order to try and identify causes of algal blooms in lakes in the Muskoka area to support the district. And we're applying that same framework here. So our goal here was to apply the Peninsula Lake framework to Stewart Lake and use those same lines of evidence to see if we could determine the cause of or the likely causes of the cyanobacteria blooms in Stewart Lake. The scope of our work was we didn't end up having to make much modification to the weight of evidence approach because the data was very similar to what we used for Peninsula Lake. So we kept the same weight of evidence approach, which I'll go over in a minute, what that entails. We compiled the existing information on the lake. So that would be data from the Ministry of the Environment, from the district's own monitoring program, from the Lake Association's annual monitoring reports, historical reports on shoreline, all of the emails Beverly mentioned, and all of the photos that you guys sent in as part of the survey, that sort of information as well. We had a small field program, which was in the late fall of 2021, which I'll speak to. And then we looked at the modeling data for the lake from the district's lake model to look at the phosphorus budget, to look at the likely sources of phosphorus and whether or not there was any indication that that those sources have changed over time or have contributed in a significant way to the cyanobacteria blooms in 2010 and then again in 2020 and 21. And we also looked at whether or not there would be any additional information that would be required if we couldn't determine a cause. So the weight of evidence approach is focused on looking at the ecology of the algae, the weather conditions or climate, development in the lake, and phosphorus concentrations, and relating those conditions to the timing and occurrence of the cyanobacterial blooms that have been documented. So we were working strictly with blooms that were confirmed and documented, and that usually comes down to the Ministry of the Environment and the environmental officers that visit the lake when spills action is called. So those emails were used to reconstruct a bloom history as best I could with the information that was available, and I'll speak to that more later. And then the weight of evidence approach itself is a bunch of different data that we look at each individual potential cause of an algal bloom and see whether or not there are changes in those conditions that might relate to or support the timing of the algal blooms that we know about. And so what that looks like pictorially is something like this. So at the top, you have the lines of evidence that we considered, as many as we could, depending on the available data. So our field collection in 2021, the climate data that was available from the MECP or from other sources, historical water chemistry from all of the various sources, and then algal bloom history, which is a tricky one and had to be reconstructed from photos and emails and MECP records and that kind of thing. And then all of those lines of evidence are analyzed against the information that we know. So when the blooms are occurring and whether or not step changes in those. So a step change would be a sharp increase rather than a gradual increase over time. So if a sharp increase in phosphorus occurred right before a bloom, that we might say that that's a likely contributing factor to that bloom. Or a long-term increase over time might indicate that more recent blooms could be a result of increasing phosphorus concentrations over time, as an example. And then we try and relate those linkages into and combine them all in a framework into what we feel is the most likely or the most significant contributors to the algal blooms in Stewart Lake. So on a putting that in a different format so that we can look at them one at a time, along the top of this table is all of the different lines of evidence that we considered. So I'll go through them one at a time and give them either a check mark or an X, depending on whether or not we found that there was increased bloom frequency, or and I'll speak to the other ones as we go, and that'll become clear. So starting with the cyanobacterial bloom history, increased bloom frequency is a difficult one to assess in Stewart Lake because the bloom history was a little bit difficult to reconstruct. So the 2010 bloom was a gliotrichia bloom. It was confirmed by a single email. There was one email in the data that I was given that suggested that bloom occurred and when it occurred. And without that email, we wouldn't have had any evidence of it at all. But there was not much information in terms of where it occurred, how long it occurred for, how it might have changed over time. So did it start in the near shore and then move into the deep water? Was it lake wide? Was it isolated to one bay? These are the kinds of things that are very useful for us to know. And that was missing in the 2010 bloom. In the 2020 and the 2021 bloom, we had more information because the pilot program in 2019 identified bloom history as an issue. We've improved with the district the way that information is gathered and what information is recorded, but there is still definitely room for improvement there based on what I'm seeing. So for the location of these blooms in Stewart Lake, relying on the survey data suggests what I would have expected or what we would have what we knew from talking to the district, and that is that these blooms are occurring in the near shore, and I'll show on the next slide some of the pictures of that. At least they're beginning in the near shore, and then they're spreading. They're likely spreading offshore from there as the lake mixes. The algae is moving from the near shore in concentration into the wider lake. There's no pattern, no discernible pattern in location on the lake. So it's not Kilty Bay is blooming constantly and everywhere else is fine. The bloom information that was provided by the stakeholders in the survey suggests that these blooms are occurring in the near shore throughout the majority of the lake, and that the algae are then moving around with the wind, with mixing and that sort of thing. So that's what we know of the lake history, and here's what that looks like. So this is not every picture that I was sent, but this is some of the pictures that we were sent from stakeholders on the lake, and you can see the nearshore algal growth in these pictures and somewhat mixing into the deeper water. This picture in the bottom left here is from 2020, and the pictures that are in the top right are from 2021. And it speaks to what I just said, which is that the blooms are beginning in the near shore, and that's supported by the ecology of the algae. These algae that are blooming in Stewart Lake are known to behave this way. The seed bank that they grow from is usually in sediments in the near shore, and when conditions are correct, those aconites, those cyanobacterial resting stages, grow on the sediments and then eventually release into the water column and cause blooms, or can cause blooms if conditions are right. So from our line of evidence perspective, what that means is location of the blooms. So in the location of the blooms, what we're really looking for to get a check mark here is there a specific location that is obviously problematic that might be, because remember what we're looking for as a causation study is what's the role of development is the big question. So is there a location, a particular development, or a particular area of the lake that's more heavily developed that might be identified as a hotspot location? So some of the things that were suggested in the stakeholder material was concerns over MAC tier stormwater drainage. And so that what we would expect with those two outlets being on Maple Drive and in Kilty Bay. Is there a sign that algal blooms are occurring there more frequently, or are starting there and then moving out to the lake? And that's not the case. So that's why that gets the X. It's not the case based on the data that we have. The extent of the blooms is again similar. If we've got localized nearshore blooms that are not being seen in other areas of the lake, that would suggest that you've got a localized cause. As for bloom frequency, I've given bloom frequency a check mark here because there was 3 documented blooms that I could find strong evidence of, and those were the 2010, 2020, 2021 blooms. So we did have a period there where there was no documented blooms after the first, and that suggests that there may be an increase in frequency in the more recent years in blooms in Stewart Lake, but that evidence is still more years of data will certainly be useful in determining whether or not ongoing blooms are likely to occur. So I'll move on to the biological, or from the biological side of things. There we go, to the chemistry side of things now, and start with the field program. So the map at the bottom here shows the monitoring sites on Stewart Lake from all of the monitoring programs that we received data from. So the yellow points are the Lake Association's bay monitoring sites from the annual reports. So Kilty Bay, one in Big Bay, one in Bear Bay, one in Stewart Bay. The blue, the teal sites are the sites that Hazel sampled during our field programs, both during active bloom monitoring and during our regular fall field program. And the purple and red sites are the MECP, and which is the Lake Partner Program site, and the long-term monitoring site in red, which is where the district monitors. So those 4 points in the center of the lake are all within the main deep basin of the lake, and then there's scattered sites elsewhere. So the goal of our field program for fall was to look at the oxygen status of the lake, whether or not deep water anoxia is a problem in the lake. So that is low oxygen concentrations in the very deep water near the sediment. And what that can do is result in phosphorus being released for a bunch of, due to the chemistry of the actual sediment and the way that phosphorus is bound to sediment. When you remove the oxygen from that environment, it can cause phosphorus to release into the water column, which is then available for algae and cyanobacteria are particularly good at taking advantage of that phosphorus because they can move up and down in the water column. So we wanted to understand whether or not internal loading was likely to be a problem in Stewart Lake, and whether or not the internal loading within the lake, if it was occurring, had changed over time. Because if internal loading was something that was not occurring in the past but is occurring now was an issue, we could have a situation where that released phosphorus, even though it's not necessarily being measured in annual measurements in spring, could be contributing to the algal blooms we're seeing. So I say one sample location here. We did one sample location in the deep water in the fall program. We did do additional sampling when there was actually an active bloom on the lake in 2021 as well. But the fall sampling was in October. We wanted to target the end of the stratified season. We wanted to capture what the conditions in the water column were as late in the season before the lake mixed as possible. And the reason for that is because the later in the season you look, the more likely you are to see anoxia, and we'll see why that's important in a couple slides here. Hello? Okay, so just a brief summary of the parameters we looked at. We looked at a very standard list of parameters. We looked at field measurements of pH, conductivity, and temperature, and dissolved oxygen profiles through the water column, and then we collected nutrients, metals, and general chemistry. And if there was anoxia, we did deep water sampling for iron and phosphorus as well. So the reason that we targeted late in the year, so this is historical dissolved oxygen data from the district's records. And what you can see in these figures that run from 1984 to the current year is this data is collected in August. And in general, the 2 microgram per liter sort of cutoff that we use for is dissolved oxygen low, and is it likely to be a problem, is not reached in a lot of the years. However, because they're sampling in August, and because the climate is warmed over time, and because the lakes are staying stratified for longer now than they used to, it is quite possible that that information is being missed. And so we wanted to look at what the conditions were like late in the year. And so that's what we did with our fall profile. And what we saw was what we expected to see, which was a marked low point in oxygen concentrations. So in this case, from 9 meters down to the bottom of the lake in that deep spot was low in oxygen, which definitely indicates a strong possibility that there could be phosphorus released from the sediments later in the year. So from the perspective of our lines of evidence, we have periodic anoxia is definitely a possibility. We identified that with our field program. We can't really assess whether or not anoxia has increased over time because the data that we have, the long-term data that we have, is largely collected at latest in August. And so there's no way to know whether or not those samples are the result of a circumstance where there has been no anoxia that year, or whether or not it just simply wasn't sampled late enough in the year. So we unfortunately have to leave that one as an X, and it's kind of more of an unknown than it is a no in this case. Looking at long-term phosphorus concentrations, which we would expect to be one of the main indicators, if not the main indicator of a development signal, is how phosphorus concentration has changed over time. If development was driving blooms, we would expect that we would see an indication to that in the phosphorus concentrations to a certain degree. And we don't. Both the Lake Partner Program data and the District of Muskoka data show no long-term increases in total phosphorus concentrations. The period of record of those data differs, obviously, because the Lake Partner Program is a volunteer program. And I've included for completeness the pre-2002 data that the district collected, but it is worth noting that that those data were collected by a different methodology. And because those data were collected by a different methodology, it's difficult to do a direct comparison between, say, 1990 data and 2020 data, but I've kept them there just so that the data is complete. And then looking at phosphorus further, we looked at the phosphorus budget for Stewart Lake, which is the modeling, what the model suggests the sources of phosphorus are to the lake, both from the watershed, from septic systems, from other natural sources. Precipitation falling on the lake has phosphorus in it, and then from overland runoff over cottages and over the other, in this case, would be largely MAC tier, the other developed areas in the lake. So despite the fact that monitoring showed no changes in TP, we looked at the budget and found that there was some indication that septic systems are a significant contributor of phosphorus to Stewart Lake. So approximately 40% of the phosphorus coming to Stewart Lake based on this model is coming from septic systems, or is assumed to be coming from septic systems. Now, I go into this in more detail in the actual report, and I don't want to belabor it here, but there is some evidence that that is the attenuation of phosphorus, so the retention of phosphorus in a septic system is much higher than the model suggests. And so because the model doesn't do a very good job of estimating phosphorus concentrations from septic systems, we generally say septic systems that are functioning shouldn't be releasing hardly any phosphorus into the lake, assuming that they're a decent setback away from the lake. But with that being said, some of these systems are quite old. There was a previous septic analysis done on the lake, which we reviewed, and many of the issues that were identified were resolved. However, there was still some indication of outstanding issues with septic systems. So from a management perspective, there's no immediate evidence that suggests that the septic systems are an issue. However, the modeling can't do what a septic survey of the actual active systems can do in terms of pointing out where phosphorus concentrations might be coming from. But there was no point source indications in any of the data that said this is a serious problem that we found. So documented increase in TP gets an X in this case because we didn't document any increases in total phosphorus concentrations in Stewart Lake over the time frame we had available data for. So moving on to water temperature as another indicator, warm water favors cyanobacteria. There's it's 27 or 28 degrees is the water temperature at which cyanobacteria becomes very, very much favored in fresh water. We're not at that, but you can see that since 2014, we do have 5 of the hottest 7 years on record have all occurred in the last 5 years. Now, there are some shortcomings to this data in terms of using them in our actual weight of evidence. And those are that the water temperature data that we have here is from August. That's where the most complete data is. And the measurements, so these are at a ½ meter depth in the water column, but they're not collected the same day in August or the same time in August every single year, which means that the reason that there's not a trend analysis line done through these to see whether or not it's increasing significantly or not is because we can't do that sort of analysis with these data. So there's a limitation to what we can use these data for. And what we can use them for right now is to say that there's certainly evidence that warmer water could be a factor in favoring cyanobacteria, but we can't link it directly to the blooms because we don't have water temperature data immediately prior to the blooms. The blooms aren't necessarily occurring in August. So this is one of those limitations of most monitoring programs. You get a snapshot of what the water quality is in time when you go out onto the lake. But if the bloom's not actively occurring at that time, or if you can't get water temperature data immediately before a bloom or leading up to a bloom, it's very difficult to make those direct links. So what we'll try and do later in the climate section is use air temperature, where we have a more complete record as a proxy for water temperature and see what we can find in that data. So I talked earlier about internal load related to, excuse me, related to dissolved oxygen. So when we sampled the lake, we did look for signs of internal load in the phosphorus concentrations, and we unfortunately didn't find any. So the top sample was 6.7 micrograms per liter. unfortunately didn't find any, but surprisingly didn't find any, I suppose would be a better way to put that. The bottom sample was the below the detection limit, which I found quite surprising, and actually makes me think that there might have been a laboratory issue with the sample, if I'm to be honest, which is unfortunate, but happens sometimes. So it's inconclusive whether or not there's a measured internal load in the lake, and that would be something that additional sampling could flesh out as part of a gap analysis in the future, or as part of further monitoring in the future. So documented warm water gets a check mark. We showed there's likely an increase in warm water recently. So it's a tenuous check mark because it's difficult to link it directly to the blooms, but I am hesitantly giving it a check mark for now, and we'll look in the climate data section in a minute for additional support. And then increased watershed disturbance is more of an anecdotal. There's not any indication in the district's data. So they have data that I reviewed of developments between 2008 and 2018, and there's not a significant increase in development on the lake that we noticed or could tie directly to the algal blooms. So because we had a major development in this bay, and as a result have seen algal blooms in this bay, that gets an X as well. So I'll move on to the two main climate indicators that we looked at, which is air temperature and wind speed, which are both known to contribute to cyanobacterial dominance in lakes, particularly in low nutrient lakes like Stewart Lake. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm using air temperature almost as a proxy here for what is likely happening in the water temperature, because water temperature, warmer water at the surface, is going to create a more stable water column. A more stable water column creates the anoxic conditions that favor phosphorus release. It creates a lack of mixing between surface and bottom waters that can lead to other algae settling out, while cyanobacteria can regulate their buoyancy and stay afloat, and favor cyanobacteria in a number of other ways as well. We did notice, so just to orient you on these graphs, these are the years 2010, 2020, and then two figures in 2021 of documented cyanobacterial blooms where we have a start date. And the start date of the cyanobacterial blooms is the right side of the gray box in all cases. So what we're looking at with the gray box is a period of roughly 3 weeks to a month prior to the occurrence of the bloom. And the reason that we're doing that is because the seed bank, the aconites that make up the cyanobacterial blooms for the species that we're looking at, the Anabina or Dolichospermum species and the Gliotritia, they both come from these aconite resting cells, and there's strong evidence in the literature, which is reviewed in the full report, the technical report, that the germination of those aconites is regulated by variables that include factors that would be affected by water temperature and by wind speed, by calmer, stiller water, lack of mixing, increased light penetration, these sorts of variables. So what we're looking for here is to try and, because we don't have necessarily individual data on light reaching the sediment, because that's not being collected, we rely on whether or not the water column is likely to be calmer and stiller, and therefore trigger some of those conditions in order to try and reconstruct the impact of climate history on those blooms. So in 2010, we definitely see several periods, several extended periods, even dating back before the box. The exact period of time prior to the bloom is a little bit, in the literature, is a little bit uncertain. Some say 3-4 weeks, sometimes it's 5 weeks. I've highlighted 3 weeks to a month in most of these, just to give you guys an indication of where we're looking, but there's definitely extended periods of warm water. The periods of warm water that have been documented agree with all the anecdotal information that was provided in the survey. So I have these numbers later, but there was definitely indications in the survey that stakeholders on the lake noticed, calm water, noticed hot water immediately warmer water immediately prior to the bloom, or warmer weather that would lead to warmer water. So we see it in 2010 for sure, probably the most obvious case. There's definitely an extended period here of over a week and a half prior to the bloom in 2020, where we see the same sort of thing. We see warmer than average conditions, and less so in 2021 prior to the bloom then. But it is evident in the air temperature data that we do have conditions that would potentially favor cyanobacteria. So that gets a check mark. And then I'll look at wind speed. So wind speed, we have a couple of different data sets for wind speed, and that's because the Ministry of the Environment wind speed data that I was relying on during the pilot program study and for some of the earlier blooms was not available in more recent years. So I couldn't get it for 2019, 2020, and 2021. And that was one of the delays in getting the causation studies completed, was not having that data. And the reason that I rely on that data is because the data that the MECP collects is collected on the lake. It's collected on Harp Lake, and it's collected right down near the water. And in a forested catchment, surrounded by cottages and forest, the difference between the wind speed on the water and the wind speed at an airport 100 meters away is sometimes as much as 3 to 4 times difference. And one of the things that I'm not going to detail too much here, but one of the issues that we had with the alternative wind speed data we needed to use in order to progress these studies forward was that that data seemed to not capture the low periods in wind speed as well as the Ministry of the Environment's data did, which is unfortunate. I apologize, the text did not get updated here, but I can go without the text. So looking at the figures and ignoring the text for a minute, because the text is unfortunately a holdover from the other slide. I was pretty sure I fixed that, but it looks like it didn't make it into the final. I apologize for that. What we see in the MECP data prior to the 2010 bloom. So again, same orientation. The boxes are the right side of the gray boxes is when the bloom occurred, and the boxes extending to the left are just trying to highlight a period prior to the bloom occurring. And that period of calm is generally going to result in a decrease in mixing, as I mentioned, and is going to favor cyanobacteria. And it's also going to favor the worst kind of blooms, which is the difference between a bloom that's occurring in the water column where the water is green and a scum on the water where you've got all of the algae has floated to the surface, all the cyanobacteria has floated to the surface and has created that really green slimy soup on the surface that is that much more concentrated and that much more sort of aesthetically difficult to manage and potentially toxic to our dogs and children, and can be a much more severe problem when you get a surface scum. And those really rely on calm conditions, because once the water stops mixing, the cyanobacteria come to the surface in order to try and take advantage of the nutrients that are there because the water column is not mixing, and the light also. And that's how they outcompete the algae that's below. They can't do that. So we do see in 2010 in the ministry data, it's not as apparent in the NAR data, but in the ministry data, you do see a marked period of several weeks of calm below a long-term average, below a long-term 10-year average. So the blue line is the 10-year long-term average. The orange line is the daily average from 2010 in this figure. And you see a marked period of low wind speed. Not as obvious, unfortunately, in the sorry, I had a window of pictures that was blocking it. There we go. In the 2020 and the 21 data. We do see in 2020 a brief period of a very low followed by very erratic. So it is possible that wind speed low was sufficient in order to encourage a bloom, and that the mixing that followed helped to move that bloom into the water in 2020. It's much more difficult to sort of point to it in the same way as we do 2010 and say this is a clear-cut sign of a bloom, and 2021 is very similar. There's some indication in 2021 that there's low wind speed prior to the blooms, but the data just is not as good.
Related to that, very quickly, Chris, there was a question in the direct chat. He was just asking if you could clarify the bloom years he was saying that after 2011, he had understood there was only a single bloom year. I just wanted to clarify that in the slide.
2010, August 2010. There's an
Okay.
email between Anna DeSalis at the Lake Partner Program and I
Okay.
believe Rebecca, who's on the call right now. And that
Okay.
was a Gliotrichia bloom, which is the first documented bloom that I have evidence of. 2020, there was sampling done by Riverstone. So the causation study for Stewart Lake was initially begun by Riverstone Environmental, and then was stopped and restarted for reasons that we won't dive into. And that bloom was documented by Al and his crew. They sampled it. I've gone through that data that they used to sample it. And then 2021, there was an active bloom that was confirmed by the MECP while this ongoing causation study was done. I heard, or not heard, but rather read of blooms or cyanobacteria dominance conditions in some of the reports, but in terms of the standard that we used to determine when a bloom occurred, which was confirmation through the MECP's spills action program that a bloom had been collected, identified, and confirmed. Those are the years that I'm using. So that's 2010, 2020, and 2021.
Okay. Paul, does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, just to clarify, I think it's very important that, you said something that by the numbers, 2010, 2011, and then 2021 once, that looks like an increase, but no, that's not an increase. If it was 2020, then 21 and 22, that would be an increase, but just an insulated one at 2021. I just wouldn't use the words increasing in frequency because that doesn't look like an increase. It's maybe a flat line or could even be a decrease. And
I'll let Chris answer that, and maybe we'll get into those questions a little more, Paul, at the end of the presentation, but I just figured to start to clarify what he was saying in this presentation, and then maybe we'll get into the rest after, if that works.
thank you.
No problem.
The increase that I was indicating was based on a bloom in 2010 and then a bloom in 2020 and 2021. So 2 consecutive blooms, 2 consecutive years after a 10-year gap. And I was trying to caveat that when I was discussing it, that more data, there was no bloom as far as I know in 2022. More data is obviously better there for whether or not there's a real increase in frequency over time. So the increase in frequency over time is a very sort of tenuous one. We have 2 blooms in the last couple of years, no bloom this year, but we didn't have any blooms prior to that except for the 2010 one that were confirmed by the information that I had. So that's what I was alluding to. Where was I? Oh yeah, okay. So looking at the stakeholder side for looking at climate history and the weather data that we have. So we had 9 total respondents that responded to our question of whether or not they had observed any sort of warm calm periods around the times of the blooms that they had witnessed. And all of them said yes. So I've just included a couple of quotes just as an indicator that the evidence that is of stakeholders on the lake supports the evidence that's being collected from the climate data from both air temperature and wind speed that I just went over. So that the blooms were happening after it's been very hot, or that it was an unusually warm season, or that a long hot spell. And I didn't put quotes from all 9, but those are 3 that I picked, and the rest were very, very similar. So in this case, both warm air and increased low wind periods periods of low wind period get a check mark as confirmed based on the data that we have available. I would have liked to have better data for 2020 and 2021 to strengthen that argument, but the 2010 data, the initial bloom that occurred on the lake, initial documented bloom that occurred on the lake was pretty strong. So based on those, I am comfortable saying that we've documented both warmer air and warmer water periods that have led up to blooms. So to summarize, because we've now been through all of our indicators, it's our opinion that the cyanobacterial blooms on Stewart Lake were likely triggered by weather factors that include air temperature and a period of calm wind speed leading up to the blooms. That's supported by the ecology of the algae. So Gliotrichia does not respond to phosphorus in the water column. This has been well documented in peer-reviewed publications in the northeastern United States particularly. But research on oligotrophic algal blooms is still very much ongoing. But one of the very well documented things for Gliotrichia is it really does take up all of its phosphorus from the sediment before it releases into the water column, and the phosphorus that it absorbs in that sediment is sufficient for it to multiply those cells multiple times and then ultimately lead to a bloom and a surface scum if the conditions are correct. And there is no indication based on the evidence that we have that development could be directly linked to the cyanobacterial blooms in 2010 or 2020-21. So that was what we had in the scientific evidence. For our gap analysis and recommendations for Stewart Lake, I'm not covering all of them. There'll be more than these few in the report, but since we're still developing recommendations and waiting for obviously feedback from stakeholders on the draft reports, we don't want to finalize all of our recommendations until we've heard from everybody else. So, but one of the recommendations that I made in 2019 and have been working with the district on other projects and has been pointed out here as continuing to be an ongoing issue is the documentation of cyanobacterial blooms. And so for watershed management, for long-term monitoring, for continuing to gain information on what's causing blooms not in each individual lake, but in the Muskoka River watershed as a whole, and connecting that data, that information to the other data that we're collecting through these monitoring programs. We really need a better documentation system for recording blooms. And the more information we can gather, the better. And I think that because of the resources that it would take to collect that sort of information, I've been looking at ways to develop a citizen science-based program where there's similar ones for the EPA where they're actually app-based, where there's an app that you can have on your phone and you can use it to record information from the lake, and that information can go to a central database, which when somebody like me comes along and wants to compare those bloom data to data that's been collected from weather stations, from water chemistry, from whatever, we have a much better idea of when the bloom started, how long the bloom was there for, where the bloom started. Did it start everywhere at once? Did it start in one particular place and then just blow somewhere else? All these kinds of details are very important when you have to do these sorts of studies where you're looking at a cause and an effect, and you want to be able to relate those two things to each other, but can't be monitoring on the lake every day in anticipation of a bloom because it's just not realistic to do that. So developing a watershed-wide citizen science-based bloom watch program is something that I've tried to identify as a priority for the region, and I think it's something that we're going to continue to work on, but that's still in progress. And then specifically to the actual management of phosphorus side of things, while Gliotrichia does draw phosphorus from lake sediments and not the water column, any phosphorus that's coming from overland sources, from cottages, from septic systems, and these sorts of things is inevitably making its way into the sediments as it settles out from the water column, or some of it is anyway. And so ongoing management of that phosphorus load in order to decrease the probability of, or decrease the amount of sediment that's available for those algae to absorb from the sediments is potentially valuable. Stormwater and runoff reduction is always valuable because while it may not immediately affect Gliotrichia blooms, Gliotrichia are some of the lower toxin producers amongst cyanobacterial species. And if you had a shift to higher phosphorus, you could end up with other species blooming, which are going to be a much greater health concern, microcystis or something like that, that could potentially be a concern. So I think ongoing stewardship, which I know is a big part of what is already being done, but and I do review this in more detail in the report. I didn't get into it because I didn't want the presentation to be too long here, but there was indications in the shoreline monitoring report and the shoreline mapping that was done by the district that there's definitely room for improvement in terms of buffers, in terms of just general shoreline management that can be participated in by cottage associations. I've also made some septic system recommendations within the report that you guys will be able to see. And I think stormwater monitoring, while there was no indication, so I reviewed the 2014 stormwater monitoring report. There was no indication in that report that stormwater was an issue based on the data that Bev collected that was done by Bev Clark in 2014. He didn't see any issue. The long-term data that's being collected by the Lake Association in Kilty Bay, where there's one of the outfalls, and there's nothing being collected near Maple Road Drive. So there is definitely potential that the Lake Association could shift some of their monitoring to focusing on that. If that's an area of concern for the Lake Association, there is opportunity to monitor that as a specific source of phosphorus and other contaminants to the water at that source, but there's no indication based on the data that we have that it's contributing to the cyanobacterial blooms that we've documented. And I'll throw to Beverly so that I don't lose my voice and she can close us out with the next steps.
Yeah, so these are just next steps of what we're doing at this phase. So so as I said, we did have a draft report. We're waiting for this meeting to sort of finalize that and have a few more discussions with District of Muskoka. But we have committed to submitting that report for posting for public comment 1 week from today. And that will be posted for 2 weeks for commenting period. And then those comments will be incorporated into the report primarily through a list of the comments received and responses, unless there's something that's substantial that needs to get addressed in the report itself. We will be preparing that final report for early January, first week of January, and then that will also be posted on Engage Muskoka. And then the presentation to council will follow after that by District of Muskoka staff to speak to the results of the study and address sort of next steps of what will happen. So that's sort of the next step process. And with that, I'll switch slides, Chris, but I think we're at the end. So I think we're going to open up to questions at this point. So what I would suggest is the easiest is if you do have a question or you would like to speak to, feel free to raise your hand. So in the bottom of the Zoom screen, it has a reaction symbol. You can raise hand through that, and then I can unmute you. You can turn on your camera or not. Alternatively, you can send your message in a chat and we are happy to read it out as well. So we'll start with that. Then would just request that when people ask their questions, they can just say their name and their interest in the project. That just helps us with the record for us, because we are compiling all of this to sort of summarize the meeting as well. Okay, so I see Margaret's hand up. Trish, I did see that your video came on. Did you have a question as well? Okay, perfect. So I saw yours on first, so I'll do that first, and then we'll switch over to Margaret after that. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just curious about the gap between 2010 and 2020. I've been someone who has had, like, right on in front of my dock. I'm Trish Thornton, and I'm on Stewart Lake Road. I'm kind of just in a little bay that doesn't usually get tested, but anyway. But I've been sending pictures almost like the past 5 years
Okay.
to the, I guess it's the ministry.
Mhm.
So I'm just confused because it's definitely like the past 5 years. Like I
Mhm.
had one of those like paint, like looked like paint on top of my, and I know sometimes the people don't get sent out until after it's all cleared up, but
Right.
so I've just been sending pictures. Is it worth it for me? Like, should I just stop that if it's not?
So I know Chris knows this pretty well, sort of what the procedure is. So I'll let him lead that question. But I do understand, Chris, that it's just the ones that are recorded, right?
Yeah, I'll just answer the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's definitely worth it to document the blooms, Trish. And yeah, so the MECP's procedure for documenting blooms is through the spills action. So, and it's related to, oh, somebody asked me to start my video. Okay. Right in the middle of answering the question. Yeah, so the MECP's procedures to come out and sample, they collect a sample. I'm not actually sure what their cutoff is. I've never been able to get information on specifically what their cutoff is for what is a bloom. Like what concentration they look for when they're doing their microscope counts. If they confirm a bloom through a microscope count, they send those samples off to get tested for toxins, and they use the toxin analysis to decide whether or not they need to issue warnings, close beaches, do all those sorts of things on the lake. So if you're getting near shore algal growth or cyanobacterial growth near your dock, taking pictures of it is unlikely to yield anything from the MECP, but from my perspective, is very useful information, particularly because the pictures that you take on any modern cell phone or camera are going to document when you took them. And obviously you're going to know where you took them. So that sort of information is very valuable and can be, this is the kind of information that I would like to be getting from more people on the lake and putting into one central place where we can draw on it and reconstruct what the bloom looked like. I would like to add to that the ability for people to draw on a map or to take pictures on a cell phone that's GIS integrated, where they can say, here's where I am, here's the algae that I see, here's the area that it's covering. If it's a foot out from your shoreline, it's quite possible that they might come and sample it. And even if it looks bad, it might not be sufficient in concentration to be defined as a bloom. So when I say between 2010 and 2020, there was no blooms, what I mean is, what, like as Beverly said, there was nothing that was confirmed by the ministry, who is the authority on determining what a bloom is right now. And if we want to start gathering more information, we need to work with and through the MECP to do that. But we can also, what I'd like to start to collect is the information that the MECP doesn't collect, is all that anecdotal information that is more useful for determining, was the bloom in 2012 worse than the bloom in 2014 in a hypothetical situation? Was it bigger? Did it start in a different place? And that kind of information can be very important.
Right, because
but you're not going to get that from the ministry. Is not going to collect that information. Their environmental officers aren't trained to do it, and it's not part of their mandate to do it. They sample where they're called. So if you call them and say there was a bloom on my dock, they'll come and sample off your dock. If the bloom blew away, they are not going to usually get in a boat and go chasing it for the most part, right? So
and even this year saying that there wasn't any, there was definitely like that paint right at our sluice gate. The water was very low this year, and so it was green there. And the other thing, and I'll stop taking over here, but and I know something about how development has made an impact on it, and your data is up to like 2018 or 19. We since then are now having a ton of development. So I would put an asterisk beside that, because like right across the lake from me, there's nine places are being built right now. So, okay, I'll stop.
Thanks. I had a Margaret, and then I think Paul wanted to speak as well. So why don't we start with Margaret, since she was first, and then I'll move over after that.
Okay, so I've unmuted myself, or perhaps you
Perfect. That's great. Yeah.
I've got, I guess, 3 comments that I want to make. One of them addresses this notion that there were no algal blooms between 2010 and 2020. I think one of the things that's happened over time is that there has been a lot of education provided by the Muskoka Watershed Council, amongst other organizations. And so there is an increased awareness of the presence of algae and algae blooms on the lake. I can tell you for a fact that we have had algae, like visible algae in the water column virtually annually since 2010, 2011, but not necessarily scums. So, you know, those of us who saw the accumulation of algae and the heavy green tint in the water when we were swimming, or, you know, the residue of the algal bodies in our bathing suits, we didn't necessarily report those because there were no visible scums. So I guess one of my questions is, should we actually be reporting the accumulation of algae in the water column in the future? So that's my first question. A reiteration of Tricia's point, the development on the North Shore is just now coming into full gear, if you will. And my hope is that between the municipality and the district, that there will be an ongoing effort to monitor the impact of that new development, because certainly in the years up until now, as you have rightly pointed out, there has been limited development, but what we're now seeing is a much larger scale and broader scale of development. So that my second point. My third one has to do with the Citizen Science Bloom Watch program. And I expect you're all aware of the Muskoka Watershed Council Algae Monitoring Program. And as a lake association, we were in fact successful in being admitted to that program this year. So the citizen science piece has already started on this lake, and I'm sure it will continue. So a couple of questions, at least one question and a couple of comments. Thank you.
Okay, so just to tackle the development that's occurring on the North Shore. So if that is just kicking off now, from the perspective of this study, of this causation study, our data cutoff obviously would have been before that. So we began the study and then collected all of the data that we could get up to a certain point. And because the development is just occurring now, we wouldn't really be able to compare that data, that new development, against the blooms that have already occurred. So it's not something that I could have used specifically to inform on the 2010, 2020, and 2021 blooms. But it is always worth keeping an eye on those sorts of things. So I can't speak to what should be done moving forward for that development, as it's not relating to the causation study, but that's why we wouldn't be able to use that in the causation study. And what was your first question?
Algae in the water column.
Was algae in the water column? Yeah,
Yeah.
whether or not you should be reporting algae in the water column. So this is the short answer is yes. And I think the study that's being done concurrently, one of the studies that's being done concurrently with this one, which is 3 Mile Lake, they've been dealing with so many blooms for such a long time that the emails that I was going over from that lake, you can see the people who like do the sort of reports all of the time and know when they're going to report it. You know, the algae has started to grow on the near shore, but it hasn't triggered the whole bay hasn't turned green yet, so I'm not going to report it because they know they're not going to get a bloom identified. But I would say if you're noticing a shift in the color of the water from from like blue black to green, not all algae blooms, not all cyanobacterial blooms are going to occur as a surface scum. And one of the things where we've got more data that we saw in 3 Mile Lake is that those blooms were delayed, or in some cases didn't occur as severely as a result of the climate conditions that were occurring. So when there was not those periods of calm, the blooms didn't occur until much later in the year, when there finally was, when there wasn't periods of calm earlier in the year. So, but in terms of actually reporting blooms, if you think that there's cyanobacterial growth and you're noticing it on swimsuits, and if your white dog jumps in and comes out partially green, it's definitely worth reporting, even if it's not a surface scum. You might end up not actually, it might not be in sufficient concentration to be detected as a bloom, but I think it's certainly worth reporting, and it's certainly worth documenting, because it's important information in terms of when the algal growth in the water column is a regular part of living on the lake. Over the course of a year, the types of algae change in a very natural and predictable way in most lakes in the Muskoka region. But if you're noticing a complete shift in the water column from blue black to green, I think it's definitely worth reporting. If that if you are reporting them consistently and it's coming back and it's not being identified as a bloom, then maybe you wait until you see a more significant sign of a bloom in future years. But I think getting an indication of whether or not these are blooms that are occurring is useful information, because otherwise that 2010 to 2020 gap seems like a gap to me, because there's nothing confirmed. Now you might report that and not get a confirmation as well, which then I wouldn't consider it a bloom from our perspective. I would just consider it algal growth that is considered to be normal by the MECP.
All right, Margaret, that answered all your questions?
Yes, thank you for that.
No
You're
problem.
welcome.
Any other questions? Raising of hands, any in the chat function? Oh,
Go
I've
ahead,
got
Paul.
a raised hand. Go ahead, Paul. 1 second.
Thank you. And thanks for all the information from your team. It's very, very helpful. I'd like to hear from anyone that's been on the lake for a long time, to see your experience, to hear your experiences of what you've seen in this, with the blooms and things, maybe 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago, before we started, charting things like that. I'd love to get a perspective on that, and that might help with trends.
Is there anyone on the line who could speak to that?
I'm just wondering, Paul, what's your history on the lake and what's your interest in?
I'm on Stewart Lake Road, and I've been here. I was in diapers when my parents built it 50 years ago, but now I haven't been watching for it. It wasn't on my radar. When stuff is posted in MacTier Public Beach about, don't go swimming, I'm in there all the time. I really didn't care. And we have a great time. I've never gotten sick or heard of anybody, but, just because you're not aware of something doesn't mean it's not happening. So I've been here for a very long time, and I've seen the green things, but I don't remember what years, and I really wasn't aware of it. So I'm just curious what people remember from, before 2010, and what have they seen? And is this something that's new, or is it something that, it's just been part of the cottage life here for a long time? Curious to get those perspectives.
Actually, and on that note, Margaret, I'm not sure that you spoke to sort of your relationship with the lake either. So if you don't mind, just for our record, stating that as well.
Sorry, like Paul, I've been on the lake for about 52, 53 years. I was, just a young thing at the time. And in terms of my interest, I'm a past president of the Stewart Lake Association, and am currently involved in the Muskoka Watershed Council algae monitoring water collection program. The water quality issues are one of my passions.
Gotcha. Okay. To that end, we did post a survey that asked for some of these general observations, as well as a summary result. I can bring it up. Maybe if we have more questions, I'll bring it up and see if I can answer some questions sort of anecdotally about what we had heard. I think maybe someone on the line can't speak to it, but we did receive a number of survey results as well. So I'll see what I can do to pull that up, and then
I've got the survey here.
Yeah.
I've had the survey up. There's the questions that we asked in the survey. None of the responses were indicative of a history of blooms
Mhm.
dating back prior to the 2010 bloom. We got how many responses? 38 responses to the survey, and I did summarize some of the information in terms of where the blooms were occurring, and I've summarized some of the information in terms of the conditions leading up to the blooms. But there was then, and I've looked through the pictures of the blooms, and there was no photos of the blooms that I could date to any time prior to 2010. But that doesn't mean that blooms weren't occurring. Again, the only thing I can speak to on this is 3 Mile Lake. And 3 Mile Lake, there's been a paleo study done by Liz Favot. She's at the MECP now, but she was at Queen's University, and she did a down core analysis at 3 Mile Lake and showed that there was potentially cyanobacterial blooms that were occurring in the mid 1940s and in the 1990s based on information that she found preserved in the sediment record, which is sort of the work that I did before this work was similar to that. That study's not been published, so it's unpublished data, and it's not necessarily directly relevant to Stewart Lake either. But there is some indication that cyanobacteria is not necessarily new, but there's no indication in the survey data or anything else we have of significant blooms prior to the one that's been documented in 2010.
That answer your question, Paul?
Yeah, thanks very much. Appreciate that.
Well, the last thing I'll say is this is one of the reasons why I want to make sure that these sorts of data are being documented while they're happening, because it's also almost impossible to reliably collect that information. In the Peninsula Lake study, this showed up when we did the survey and asked people about previous blooms, and in a lot of cases people couldn't agree on what year the blooms occurred, not the immediate bloom that had just occurred. Everybody, that was the front of mind one, but there had been blooms in the 90s, and some people said it was 92 and some people said it was 94, and it's very difficult to remember things that happened 20 years ago that you didn't think about at the time. And so that's why it's so important for the future of trying to manage some of these water quality issues. It's so important to know when they're occurring.
Any other questions?
I have a question again, sorry.
Hi, Margaret.
Chris has made the comment that, we should be collecting, pictorial evidence, anecdotal evidence, whatever. I guess I'm not clear as to where these things should be collected.
I'll leave that to you, Chris.
Where they should be collected. Well, I suppose the answer to that would be wherever. The reason that I think it needs to be a citizen science focused effort is because it's not plausible for the district or even a private firm necessarily to be able to deploy somebody. Sometimes these blooms will dissipate in an algal growth might occur, and it might dissipate in a few hours or in a day, and then you'll see nothing. But then it'll come back 2 weeks later. And one of the things that we think is happening there is that you're getting near shore growth that's being mixed into the water column. And so it looks like it disappears, but then you get calm conditions and it all rises up to the surface. And that's when you actually get your quote unquote bloom. But the growth that led to that bloom actually occurred prior. And so what you should record, or where you would record it, would be, in this case, what I would target would be getting people involved in recording what's right off of their own shoreline, ideally, but not everybody is going to be willing to necessarily participate in that program. So what I would hope to have on some of the lakes that are blooming more frequently is a group of people with fairly good coverage of the lake that if they started to see algal growth, cyanobacterial growth in the near shore or in the lake, would go out and on their boats and would photograph where it's occurring or draw on a piece of paper that they could scan and send and take a photo and send to the district where it's occurring. Just, we saw algae in these places. and as well as calling the MECP to report a potential bloom. And that information gives future scientists an indication of where the blooms are starting. Because some of the information that I had for this study was based on the survey information. So I'm asking people to try and remember where they saw the blooms. But also we have to remember that where people saw the blooms is going to be painted by where they live on the lake. So when you look at somebody who said, I see the blooms in the northwestern part of the lake, they also usually live in the northwestern part of the lake. And people who say they see them in the south usually live in the south. And so that tells me that the blooms are likely occurring on, the shoreline of the majority of the lake at once. But having more specific information would allow me to draw the lines between the data that we collect on temperature and phosphorus and all those other things to the actual blooms a lot better. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, can I ask a follow-up question then?
Of
So
course.
I get the, reporting to the MECP through the spills hotline. I'm wondering, I know there are a couple of people on this call from the district. Is there a way of reporting pictorial or anecdotal evidence to the district? Is there a capacity to collect that?
Cassie, do you want to stab, or Christy maybe?
Go ahead, Christy.
Sorry.
It's a question that has been raised before. We are interested in doing that, and we haven't done it to date. Although it's been raised with us before. We haven't taken that on, in part because there's other repositories for that information, and part of what we're looking at doing increasingly is finding centralized repositories for the data, so that there aren't so many agencies and organizations having their own parts of data and then having it be difficult for people to assemble it. So right now, because the province has been the repository, we're continuing on that, and to some degree the SMDHU with its confirmation. But the district, if we were directed to do that, if that made sense in discussions with the province, we would be happy to do it. And to add to the algae, or the information that we're collecting through our water quality monitoring program, we are considering expanding that program, and perhaps we should be looking at doing it through this kind of idea too.
So at present then, if this kind of information is going to be collected, it would be up to the local lake association probably to develop their own system of collection and storage.
I think right now that's all that we have, but it's certainly something that we'd be considering in the future, perhaps.
Okay, thanks, Christy.
Chris, maybe a follow-up to that. Is there does your report provide sort of a semblance of sort of what that might look like if a lake association wanted to take it on, just to make sure it's consistently collected?
I'm trying to remember what specifically is in the report. I think the report summarizes the types of information that I would collect, but it doesn't dive into specifically how to collect them or where to store them or how to store them or anything like that. There are other
I think
projects.
that can be up to the association, but I was just thinking, like, in terms of the data you would want collected, maybe that if that's in there, then that's at least something for them to start on, so that they, can put a plan in place for the next season, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Trish, I saw your hand was up for a second, and then what?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I think Margaret covered that, because I was just wondering, like I said, I've been sending pictures easily for the past 7 years. And I'm just wondering if I'm sending them to the wrong place. Are the right people getting the information? Because I'm really dismayed by that 10-year gap.
And I think Chris kind of answered that, like the pictures may not indicate an algal bloom,
Yeah.
but shows where algal growth is happening. So it might not be classified as an algal bloom,
Right.
or they might not have gotten out in time. And so I think maybe Chris can answer more, but it sounds like the best way to do it is that information is still useful. It just might not be useful for MECP identifying a bloom, something that qualifies as a bloom, right?
Yeah,
So,
and I don't think they have, like, even the guy who has come out to my place a couple of times, he says, you know, I just cover too much of the area. Like they just they can't be responsive. So that's another worry.
sure. Chris, any other comments on that?
Not really, without getting into the politics of the MECP. No, the data is useful, and finding a reliable place to store it is important. So the report should have information on what type of information to collect for the lake associations if they want to start taking the initiative to do that on their own. I'll maybe have a look at it in the revision stage and make sure that information is as complete as I want it to be, because I can't remember specifically at this moment exactly what I wrote in terms of the details of what to collect, but I'll make sure that recommendation is fleshed out if you guys would like to look at implementing it on your own. I envisioned that as being something that was hopefully going to be much broader, but it's not. Yeah, and it sounds like Christy and the district are interested in working on that and moving forward with that as well. And I know I've worked with the district on other projects, and that recommendation has come up before, and they've shown interest in it there. It's just a question of getting. What I'd like to do is not just provide recommendations to a lake association and have them run with it. Well, that's good in the short term, certainly. Standardizing that across anybody who wants to participate in the program is also very important. So everybody is collecting the same sort of information in the same way is going to be very important as well. But I'm sorry that your sort of your reports and your evidence has gone unheeded, or whether obviously I can't speak to whether or not those occurrences were sampled and determined to be not a bloom, or were not sampled, because the documentation, I went through every single email from the MECP related to this lake that I was given, and there's just no documentation that I have in order to work with. So I'm unfortunately limited in what I can do based on the information that I have available. And I know that the district saved absolutely everything related to the lake and sent it all to me. So I don't question that if that data was there, they would have sent it to me. But
and Krish, on that note, did you send that information as a part of the survey or as a part of participation in this study?
I've just been sending it to the spill, and I mean, Margaret and I have been sending pictures back and forth too. So I don't know if they go elsewhere, but yeah.
Okay. I mean, that was part of the reason we did the survey and had those touch points, just so we could get some of that information. I mean, obviously we've written the report now, but you feel free to send it over, and at least it'll be on the radar of the district and ourselves at this point.
Yeah, and the survey, I'm sure I took it, and I would have indicated that I saw it, but I guess I can't remember if there was an opportunity to upload pictures or not. So
I think there was, but that's okay. Like, feel free to forward it over to Cassie. At least we'll have it on record and keep it in the data file. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. All right. I'm not seeing any. I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for your time, and thank you for coming. If there's something that comes up to you later that you aren't sure about, or this meeting's over but you wish you'd ask that question, Cassie's contact information. Chris, actually, I think we had put it on the slide, the last slide. I think maybe just bring that up so that people can write it down in case they want to contact Cassie directly with an additional question, and then we can put that in our list. So I think the next slide, that one, yeah. So Cassie's email is here. Feel free to take that. She's the contact person at the district, and does sort of compile all of that and let us know if anything comes in. As I said, the report's going to be posted next week, and there will be an opportunity to review it, submit comments and questions. And we will be reviewing all of that prior to the finalization of the report. And again, it will be posted on the Engage Muskoka website. And yeah, thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to finalizing this and answering any future questions or comments that you might have. With that, maybe I'll leave it to Cassie to end off the meeting, and thank you all for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Beverly, and thanks, Chris, for your presentation. I think that I can speak for all the district staff on the line and probably everyone here on the line that we certainly learned a lot this morning, and we look forward to diving into the draft report. So like Bev said, thanks everyone again for your time this morning, for your effort throughout this entire project, and we look forward to some more of your comments as we draft the final report. So thanks, everyone.
And I think this was mentioned, but this will also be posted online. So if other people who are unable to attend can also add comments or send over questions, and we can answer those as well. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.